we are approaching the 3-month mark of the U.S.-Israeli war of aggression on Iran. And despite these ongoing negotiations through Pakistan, the two sides remain deadlocked on the core issues that we've been covering on this show. Trump is once again threatening to resume bombing Iran within days if a deal isn't reached, while the Israelis, of course, continue pushing for renewed escalation. At the same time, Iran appears to be preparing for the possibility of another round of war, rebuilding military infrastructure, tightening its control over the Strait of Hormuz, and warning that any future confrontation could actually expand beyond the region. So, to discuss all of this, we are once again joined by Tehran-based journalist Navid Zarrinal, who's also host of the Colony Archive. Navid, it's so great to have you back on the show. Hope you're doing well.
Rania and Zoe, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's just jump right into it, Navid. I wanted to actually ask you, as we have another deadline approaching, I mean, it just kind of feels like we're stuck in a time loop where every week Donald Trump threatens, apocalypse if a deal isn't made and then backs down from that apocalypse. But, let's see what happens. But the New York Times did recently report that Iran has been using the ceasefire, as they put it, the ceasefire period, to regroup militarily, rebuilding missile sites, relocating launchers, and adapting tactics in anticipation of another possible confrontation that could be looming. And we keep hearing these warnings again every week that the war could restart at any moment. I wanted to hear from your perspective, how real do you sense this threat of another round of war is right now? And I assume Iran is, but I have to ask you, is Iran preparing for renewed bombing? And does Iran, believe the U.S. and Israel are genuinely looking for a settlement or simply trying to buy time and reset for another attack?
So in terms of the readiness, I would say that the Iranians are ready, whether it's the people who are coming onto the streets every night. There are thousands in Tehran that come out every night, and across the country, it's millions of people that come out every night. There's a website where people registered to indicate their readiness to fight a ground war in case the U.S. attacks Iran via the Persian Gulf island, through a ground operation. And I think the numbers are over 40 million right now who have signed up to fight a ground war. And even if they're not directly fighting, they will contribute to the war effort in other ways, such as by cooking food for the soldiers. So the people are ready. And the state, too, I think the Iranian state is also ready, because despite the claims of the Trump administration that Iran's missile launchers and missiles have been depleted and they have no defenses left, I don't think that's true. I think there are a lot of missiles that are still available, and they keep producing them, and also the drones that, as you know, are pretty cheap to produce, and Iran has a lot of them in case the US reverse engineered the Iranian Shahed drone that Russia had also used in the war against Ukraine, and I think he called it the Lucas drone, and those are also plenty available. Iran is relatively weaker when it comes to the air defenses, so stopping the US fighter jets and the Israeli fighter jets from bombing Iran. But then when it comes to the retaliation and the precision of their missiles, the reports indicate and the evidence indicates that they're pretty strong in that area. So the state is also ready. So I would say both the people and the states are ready for another round. And the mood here is pretty resilient and inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because there have been numerous reports in Western media saying that, it would be expected, but that the Iranian people are exhausted, that after months of war, they're ready to compromise at any cost, and that people, are frustrated. But then on the other hand, as you say, you're saying that it's hardened people's resolve, and that people are even more defiant. So can you talk about what you're actually seeing on the ground? Is it more of this mood of kind of defeatism and compromise, or are people feeling, or what is kind of the sentiment there with regards even to the U.S. and Israel?
No, it's definitely the opposite of defeatism and compromise. And Maybe I've been avoiding the Western media, but I've been seeing that even some of the Western media are admitting that the Iranian states and people are resilient. But you're right that there's also that kind of other part of the Western narrative that Iran is about to collapse at any moment, to the point that even people who are pro-resistance and they understand the nature and the resilience of the Iranian state and economy, they might even buy into that narrative at some point. I know people who are supposed to be pro-resistance who had bought into that narrative in the first days of the war, but then they saw what happened,
Mhm.
and I think they were also all surprised. But I'll make one point, a contrast between the pre-war and the post-war. So pre-war, there was some defeatism, and there was this idea that the inflation is really bad, things are not getting better, so let's just compromise and concede. And you had the reformist camp within Iran who had that mentality, and I would also see it in when I would socialize with people, and they would say that. But after the war, things have changed. I see less complaining. People have higher spirits, and they don't have the defeatist mentality anymore. And they understand that Iran had the upper hand in the war, and they understand that now through the Iranian leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is actually the country that would be able to get concessions from the US. So everything that I'm seeing here, with some exceptions, of course, is the opposite of defeatism.
Naveed, I wanted to ask you. I saw this reported yesterday that Iranian officials warned that if the US and Israel resume bombing Iran, the next phase of the conflict won't remain geographically contained the way it largely has so far, that it would go beyond the region. And this made a huge splash in the US media. And I'm curious what you think they mean by that. Are we talking about escalation maybe against US bases beyond West Asia, shipping lanes, energy infrastructure? How seriously should those warnings be taken?
Yes, no, it's a good question, and I saw that warning too. And there's one possibility that it could just be kind of talking tough, and kind of it's like war talk, that they're trying to play up their capabilities. But the other possibility is that they actually mean it, like they did with the 40-day war, because the Iranian leader said that if this time you come and attack us, it will become a regional war. And after he was assassinated, that pronouncement was
Mm.
actually put into action by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and by the Iranian defense. And so what happened during the 40-day war is that Iran targeted, I think, 10 countries in which there were US and Israeli interests. And one of them was Cyprus. So Cyprus is not a regional country, it's not part of the West Asian region, but then Iranian missile, I think, successfully penetrated Cyprus. So I think that's what they could mean, is that some of the missiles have the longer ranges, and they could probably reach as far as Cyprus and even further. So in that sense, it could become a war that's larger than a regional war. But whether China or Iran would get China or Russia would get directly involved on behalf of Iran, that's unlikely. So I don't think they would get into a direct military confrontation with the US over Iran. So it can't be, beyond the region in that sense. But I think China and Russia will continue to support Iran through intelligence and trade.
Well, one of the big developments in the last couple of months is Iran moving to formalize and institutionalize its leverage over the Strait of Hormuz through a new entity, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, and the announcement of a supervision area requiring transit authorization. What does this actually mean in practice, and how significant is this for the global economy if tensions do continue to escalate?
Yes, that's also a good question. I saw a report about that too, that they're trying to formalize some sort of control and management over the Strait of Hormuz. And one thing that the Iranian authorities have suggested is that they would use an insurance system. So every ship and vessel that passes through the strait would be insured by Iran, and that insurance would have a cost. But in this way, I think they would make the kind of um, it wouldn't be a direct toll in a sense. So it would be more an insurance that in order to be protected and safe, you'll be insured by us, and that would, continue the Iranian leverage and control over the strait, but it would also generate revenue for Iran and for the reconstruction effort. Because one thing that the Iranians asked in the 10-point plan that was offered to the Trump administration at the April 8th ceasefire was reparations. But I think the Iranians know well that, especially because it's such an affirmative ask from the US. I think it's a reasonable ask, but it's an affirmative ask. So the Americans will not give reparations to Iran because they haven't even given their own oppressed populations like Black people and Native Americans reparations. So why would they give the Iranians, who are kind of lower on that totem pole, they're not even American nationals, reparations? So they know that, but they need money for reconstruction because the damage that the US and Israel inflicted on Iran was in billions of dollars. So I think the insurance or whatever revenue they're able to generate through the Strait of Hormuz will help the reconstruction effort. And with the current leverage that they have, I think receiving some revenue from the strait is something that could happen in the near future. And there are reports that it might have happened already, that they might have already collected some toll, but I am not fully sure about that.
Okay, so I want to ask you, Navid, about two revelations that came out in the media over the last week. And one of them is related to a New York Times report that there were discussions inside of Washington and Tel Aviv about potential regime change scenarios involving former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which struck a lot of people as bizarre, given that, I'm old enough to remember Western media and the Western governments once portrayed this man as essentially like the face of evil. He was constantly equated with Hitler when he was president by the US and the Israelis. So the first part of this question is, I'm curious what you make of that report and the seriousness of it, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I saw some other people suggesting this was like some sort of disinformation ploy to like mess with the Iranians. So that's one. And the other revelation I wanted to talk to you about, which is perhaps a bit more serious, a lot more serious, I think, is the fact that we've now learned that there are two covert military and intelligence bases the Israelis built and are operating inside of Iraq. And that's been the case for years as a part of this war, this shadow war against Iran that they were conducting. The US was running cover for this base, lying to their, Iraqi allies about its existence. And in fact, a really disturbing aspect of this is that an Iraqi shepherd who stumbled across these military bases or these covert sites informed Iraqi authorities about them. According to investigations, was then basically his attempt to inform the Iraqi authorities was intercepted by Israeli operatives, and then they basically tracked him and killed him before Iraqi forces could arrive at the location that he was informing on. So, I guess first the Ahmadinejad story, and then your thoughts on these covert Iraqi bases that were used to conduct war against Iran.
Yeah, so I saw that New York Times report about US and Israel wanting to install Ahmadinejad as Iran's new leader. But yeah, I am skeptical. I mean, it is true that Ahmadinejad grew kind of less. I mean, because when he was president, he would challenge, these Western journalists. He would challenge the double standards. He would defend Iran's right to have a nuclear energy program. So he was very outspoken, unlike Khatami, who preceded him, who was a little bit softer, and he was more into the whole idea of the dialogue of civilizations. But Ahmadinejad was much more confrontational. And in a way, one reason that the sanctions intensified was because of Ahmadinejad, because he kind of was this confrontational Iranian president. And I mean, the sanctions were happening before that, but they became larger under his presidency. But over the years, especially I think he has some English language person running his social media, and he's tweeting about Tupac and NBA and like all these random things that the Americans might like. So maybe that's why they had an interest in him, because he was tweeting about, the NBA and about Tupac and about other things too, and like very humanitarian type tweets. He had become very soft, after his retirement from presidency. So maybe that there was an interest in him there, but I don't really see. I don't see how he could have been a pro-Israeli or pro-American leader, because even people, someone like Rouhani, who was president when the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was signed in 2015. I would say he would be more kind of he would be willing to give more concessions than someone like Ahmadinejad, even in his later years. So I'm skeptical of that report, but it's something that they could have discussed. It's something that they could have discussed, but whether they actually wanted to make it operational or whether Ahmadinejad would have agreed, that's another story. But regarding the operations from Iraq, that's that's something that is expected, because U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, not just to have control over those countries, but also to get closer to Iran. And if you look at the map, there are American bases all over Iranian borders and Iranian land. And what's ironic is, though, after the U.S. invasion, I would say Iran became stronger because Saddam was gone, and through the Shia networks that Iran had, Iran was able to actually have a lot of influence in Iraq. But it's kind of this double game where the U.S. has its presence and bases in Iraq, but Iran also has its influence, and I think they're kind of competing for power in Iraq. But what is very notable, the last thing I'll say, is that despite these sabotage efforts through Iraq and through Iraqi Kurdistan, including Erbil, and that's why, that's the reason that Iran has been launching missiles at Iraqi Kurdistan, because a lot of U.S. and Israeli interest there. Despite all that, Iran has been able to maintain a lot of influence in Iraq, and based on the resistance groups that are there, Iran has been able to retaliate and fight against the Americans and the Israelis, and also some of the NATO combat forces left Iraq after the Iranian operations during the 40-day war.
Well, zooming out a bit, Navid, Iran's two most powerful international partners are Russia and China. In your view, how have they done enough to support Iran during this conflict, or has the war kind of exposed the limits of these alliances? And from the perspective of Tehran, can Iran count on these countries if the war does escalate further?
Yeah, so from a purely geopolitical perspective, I think it's actually the reverse of your question, in a sense, that Russia and China are more able to count on Iran, because formerly they thought that maybe, or everyone thought, not just Russia and China, but there was kind of this speculation that a Syria or Libya-like scenario may be possible in Iran. So we'll assassinate their leaders, and then we'll create economic desperation through jacking up inflation and through freezing Iranian assets and starving them of their dollar reserves. And then people will riot after the leader is killed. And this is what they did in March. They started targeting all the police stations in the hope that people would attack the police stations, take up the arms. And they did the same thing back in the January riots, because the aim was that you help and fund certain rioters, and they go to the police stations and they take up the guns. But when that didn't work, then they did it through a military operation, but that did not work either. And it was actually really impressive how safe Iran and Tehran were after all the police stations were bombed back in March. So the hope was that you would create a Syria-like situation, and because of that, Russia and China were too worried to give Iran, their best defenses, so Russia wouldn't give, the best air defenses, or China wouldn't give the best weapons to Iran. But now that they've realized Iran was able to defend itself and withstand the assault of the American superpower and its main vassal state, Israel, I think they will count on Iran more in the future. But as I said in my previous responses, I don't think that they will ever directly confront the U.S. militarily for the sake of Iran, because they have their own realist and geopolitical interests. But if there is another round of fighting between US, Israel versus Iran, I think Russia and China will continue to provide intelligence to Iran, because it seems that they did that during the 40-day war.
Well, Navid, thank you so much for joining us. Your analysis is so important, and you're coming to us from Tehran, where you have been for the duration of this entire war. And I encourage people to go check out all of the interviews we've done with you, because you've always been on point. So we appreciate you, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Again, Navid Zarrinal, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. And last thing, Zoe said with the previous guest that Bolivia is inspiring, and Iran is also right now is inspiring if you're following it. Thank you for having me.